Well, and you can decide. I actually like, oh, being a single major. For real, for real. Okay, I'm really good to Joe. Yes. Alright.
I walked by and told you no one here.
Like, I hope this isn't something interactive.
There we go. Nice. No, how is my echo? Echo.
Wisconsin.
We're gonna get started in a minute. I'm just pulling up some notes.
Yeah, talk amongst
yourselves.
Say hello if you haven't met somebody around you.
Yeah, give us something to talk about.
Oh, you want a prompt? Oh.
Ready, go.
Perfect. I have notes, no prompts.
I'm right here.
So, hello, beautiful people. Thank you for joining us tonight. Coming out to this Nowak Society professional meetup. We host these conversations about once a month, every other month, often in Denver. Historically, we've had them in Boulder and Fort Collins. Pandemic happened, and then a lot of things got kicked to the curb. So we're gaining some more momentum. We're starting to host these events again. If you're not already on our mailing list, please go to theNowakSociety.org. That's our website. You can sign up for our mailing list. We also have an events calendar there. That's where you can make sure to scope out everything we have in the works. I can't give any formal dates right now. We're still in the planning phase, but if you make sure to scope our website, our Facebook page in the next couple of weeks, we want to post some big news about an event coming up that we're really excited about. We just haven't formalized a few details yet, so I can't say much, but it should be really, really fun. So hope to see you there. Please keep an eye out on our social media, internet, all those sorts of things, and look forward to seeing you in the future. So tonight, we have a beautiful panel of people. They are currently partnered with the Nowak Society and a research study through Colorado State University, looking at the use of psilocybin with underground practitioners here in Colorado. We're going to talk to all of them about their interest in the study, what they're finding, all these sorts of things, and give you a chance here at the end to ask them some questions about anything you want to know or anything they're finding in the study. So I'll chat with them for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. But to begin, if you all want to introduce yourselves.
Hello. I don't usually use a microphone. My name is Nicole Lilly, and I'm a community practitioner, which is a term that you might hear used this evening. I consider myself a transformational guide, educator, and mentor, and yeah, I've been a healing artist for quite some time, ketamine therapist, somatic therapist, and body worker, and many other things. So there's a lot that has me interested in this study. Thank you for having me here this evening.
Hello everybody, my name is Lucia Turpak. I'm a medical anthropologist. For my master's thesis, I conducted fieldwork at an ibogaine detox clinic in Mexico. I have a wide array of research interests, including understanding the ability of psychedelics to heal on both personal and macro levels.
Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Pam Peters, and I grew up here in the Denver area. I had my first psilocybin mushroom experience when I was, I'd say, 24, down on the beach in Mexico with my dad and my brother and my sister. And it was really transformational in many, many ways, and I feel like it's kind of informed a lot of decisions that I've made in my life. Most recently, I've gone back to school to become a relationship therapist with Regis University with the hope of eventually doing psychedelic therapy as well. And I also I'm a founding board member for the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, otherwise known as SPORE, which is sometimes a mouthful to say. And that's a little bit about me.
Hi, I'm Shannon Hughes. I'm one of the founding members of Nowak Society. Nate's a board member here, Nathan, Rob back there, Nowak Society, Dylan, just to point out some of our Nowak folks in the room. I'm also the CSU partner, so I'm an associate professor at Colorado State University in the School of Social Work. So that was the sort of the academic community partner, kind of, you know, have my leg in both worlds, the nonprofit advocacy world and the academic university world. So we were able to put this together in a really cool way, because this isn't something that I could just do from my office at CSU. You have to have teams of people, and there was no funding, there was just interest, and we'll talk more a little bit about the background and how we got into it, but I'm a researcher and educator and community advocate around drugs and medicines and mental health care and psychedelics specifically.
And I'm Riley Capps. I'm a drugs reporter for the past 5 or 6 years. My work has appeared in the Washington Post, Rooster Magazine, the Maps Bulletin, Chacruna, and the lovely, lively Double Blind Magazine, which I find the hippest magazine around. And I got interested in this because I've written a ton about underground psychedelic psychotherapists and things like that. But I think putting it into an academic study in a peer-reviewed journal might get it read in a new way by new types of people because it's vetted, it feels tangible, and so my hope is that this carries the voice of these people in a new way, perhaps farther into new corners.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Before we get started, a note for y'all. Just request that you please be generous to the Mercury Cafe. They do a great job hosting us. Obviously, things have been hard on a lot of restaurants through the pandemic, so if you can order some food, get a drink, make sure to tip your server. I know they really appreciate it, and we appreciate being able to be in their space, so that would help all of us out. Jumping back into the panel. I wonder if y'all can start about, like, what got you started? What was the problem or need you feel like inspired the purpose of the study? Like, what was the niche or gap you were looking to fill?
We're just gonna let people jump in. Okay, I'll start, and then we'll jump around. So this has been sort of a long time percolating for a couple of years. When we first were doing these kinds of like meetups in the community, we started these in Boulder actually, and we were getting questions like, well, how do we bring the underground above ground? Like, how could we have an underground practitioner be on stage and talk about their practice? Because we were only able to get like licensed therapists and, you know, psychiatrists, and they were like, but there's this like whole like underground network that's hold these different lineages, and they're doing this work, and maybe they have been for many years, and their voices aren't really, they can't be here on stage talking about their work. And so that seed was planted a couple of years ago, and we're just like been thinking about it. And then with so much policy reform happening with decrim in Denver, obviously in 2019, it's sort of sweeping the nation, and there's more to happen in Denver and in Colorado, I would suspect, in the next couple of years. And then clinical trials coming through the FDA process, and I think the default mode would be to sort of medicalize, right, through like the FDA process is inherently a medicalized process, and so these MDMA and psilocybin, for example, being available by prescription and sort of gate-kept through sort of Western medical doctors, so that's like one trajectory, and then you have this underground space happening that doesn't really get a voice, or doesn't really, you know, there's a lot of other things happening, but they're sort of shut out from the mainstream dialogue just because of the legality of it.
So partly we just wanted to think of a way that we could bring those voices to the surface in a way that would be legitimate and credible, and that would contribute to sort of the legitimate body of knowledge in sort of a Western epistemology, that it has to kind of look like this, and it has to be spoken in this way, and has to go through these channels for it to be considered legitimate knowledge. So how do we bring what's happening under here through those channels in a different way that's not like this clinical trial blah 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 stuff? Does anybody have more to add to that? Yeah.
I'd be curious for the rest of you if that's, kind of the idea. What excited you about that, or why did you want to get involved?
Well, I'll add, I think Shannon, you had put together a group of people who were interested in talking about kind of like getting ahead of the regulatory framework discussion in terms of ketamine and psilocybin in Colorado. And so all of us were a part of the psilocybin team, and we all had a ton of ideas about what we thought should happen in terms of the regulatory framework. And then I think it was kind of brought up like, whoa, like who's not on this call? Not everybody on this team is a community practitioner. And I think we just really wanted to make sure that if we're making any sort of recommendation, that we center the perspectives of people who are actually doing this work and who have been training, some of them for decades, to do this work, and who are well equipped to do this work.
I want to just add a quick thing about the type of study. So often in research you think of quantitative numbers, trials, clinical trials, double blind, all of that. And this is a qualitative study. So we actually interviewed practitioners, asked them all the same set of questions, and then we're going to be kind of putting together the themes that are coming out of that, out of all of those conversations, the similarities, the differences. So just a tiny bit about the type of research that this is. You guys have anything to add?
Yeah, and another perspective that really that I'm interested in is that there are other states out there that are making regulation, and it doesn't include the voices. And so I know I would like to be part of the solution, and this feels like part of that solution, and that Colorado and this team can hopefully create some sort of model for other places and states to consider. Because not only is it not being considered, but some of those voices are being entirely shut out and dismissed, and that's a shame.
Can you give a brief description, if it's available, of like the folks you're finding, or some of the demographics or kind of details?
In this study, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so far we've done 15 interviews here in Colorado with community practitioners. We're still enrolling, so we're still actively recruiting. We want to bump that number up a little bit more. But we've got 15 for a qualitative, in-depth qualitative research like this. 15 is a good number, but we're still sort of like pulling more information in with new interviews, so we're going to keep going with it. But so far, out of those 15, mostly women, like 9 identify as women. They're mostly white, all but 2 identify as white, and that is something we're really trying hard to address, and getting, just more indigenous perspectives, BIPOC communities, so we're really actively recruiting right now, trying to do some broader outreach so that we can have a more representative sample there. Out of the 15, only 7 are therapists. Only 7 identified as therapists, and only 1 of those said they were a licensed therapist. So that's interesting because other backgrounds were anything from like theater to computer science to I'm a massage therapist, or I'm a other type of body worker. But there was I think somebody was like in corporate something or another in a past life. So there's quite a few like different backgrounds that not even half of them actually identified as therapists as their sort of career or their main sort of gig. What else do we want to say about?
I wanted to make sure that I got a microdosing coach in there, so it wouldn't just be all talk about taking 3 grams in a room with a person. There's a lot of use that's lower doses and microdoses, so I wanted to make sure that was represented. And then I made sure to get an indigenous practitioner, got Mixtec training. That was important, I felt, to bring in that lineage. Mixtec is down in Oaxaca. It's related to Maria Sabina. that kind of thing. So I wanted to make sure that voice was in there.
Yeah, we have practitioners that range from decades of experience with Indigenous practitioners and cultural icons to people who are newer at this work. So there's a wide range of experience levels represented.
And along with that, a wide range of modalities used within the services that they provide. So things that are more ceremonial, and then also folks who might work mostly with white collar people doing microdosing and coaching.
I think some other differences, yeah, you mentioned like across these 15 individuals, just to give you a sense of the range of practices, yeah, anywhere from microdosing to macrodosing and everything in between. Some sitting for just one single session, some doing multiple sessions that could span years when they take somebody on as a client. I'm not even sure if that's the right word. And then pricing, you know, some people, I'm $1,500 for a session. Some are like, I'm a donation, just whatever they give me, put it in an envelope after we're done. So we've got, I mean, we really have quite a spread of different practitioners and how they practice and what their backgrounds are and how they came into the work. Everybody has a story of how they came into the work, and we might touch on that a little bit more. But the modalities they use and backgrounds and the dosing, there's quite a range that we're finding.
Along those lines, I'm wondering, in terms of what you're finding and all the different modalities, like there's a lot of diversity, it sounds like, in terms of how you're seeing people work. And like, what do you think that brings to the above ground? Like the underground is doing it really differently. What do you think we could learn from them?
I don't always want to jump in first. Always prepared to talk.
Well, you know the most.
Well, I think, you know, by the very nature of a clinical trial protocol, what the FDA expects to approve psilocybin as a medicine, it's going to be very standardized. So the dosing is going to be standardized, the protocol, the number of sessions, how they're held, everything's got to be controlled and standardized to try to remove any variable that might get in the way of us being able to say, this medicine causes this effect for people, and or this particular outcome, and usually it's a pretty narrowly defined outcome, like a symptom rating scale after a few months or something. And the diversity of practices on the underground are kind of showing us just that, I don't know, in this space, there's much less standardization, and what we hear from practitioners is that one of the concerns we hear is about psilocybin being over-regulated and trying, like, sort of artificially standardized into some kind of, like, narrow margin of acceptable practice. And so I think that that's just one of the concerns of if it becomes legal or if it, as it moves to the above ground, that it's going to be, like, artificially standardized in a way that it just doesn't make sense to do. And what practice, you know, years and years and many years and networks of practitioners are saying, like, no, that's not how we actually, you know, work with that would sort of like dilute the practice if you try to like fit it into a narrow box.
Yeah, I mean, the models that are being studied now, the psychological models, the community practitioners are holding theoretical frameworks and scaffolding, as one person called it, that just simply don't exist in a Western psychological model. There is attention to a lot of metaphysical concepts, energetic concepts, spiritual concepts that just aren't held by the systems that are using, I'm going to call them substances for now, in that sort of way. And so there's just an entirely different paradigm that's being operated under. And then the studies above ground are typically looking at one or the other end of the spectrum, which is microdosing or macrodosing. And there's a lot that's happening in between those. And neither of those macro or micro models really requires the therapist or the space holder to do much, you know, other than to sort of sit back and hold space. But there's this whole other space in between that people are operating under, and I'm going to refer to that as a psycholytic model, just for the sake of differentiating it from psychedelic, which is being studied. And there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of skillful intervention that's happening, and that a lot of that is based on intuition, reading energy, reading people's nervous systems, and just doing it in a very, very different way than what we're seeing.
I think another key difference between what we're seeing kind of in medical models above ground and at like psychedelic conferences, and then what we're seeing in the underground is in the underground there is a lot of respect for experience and wisdom. Above ground you might see, you know, a weekend training or a holotropic breath workshop. In the underground, that's not going to fly. You can't go to a holotropic breathwork workshop and then think that you can work with psilocybin. I was reading an interview today that I thought was so, I think Riley, it might have been one of yours, and someone was talking about how their ongoing relationship with psilocybin is key to the healing work. And actually, if they have like a clinical question about what's happening in the space or something is getting stuck, then they themselves will return to psilocybin on their own time to get to receive an answer about what to do with the client. So it's just a completely different model where practitioners are really working in tandem with these tools, with these helpers, with, you know, it's really difficult to even conceptualize like what psilocybin is. It's not just a drug. So that's something else that's kind of happening too in the underground, is there are the definitions that are held there are drastically different than even what people in the psychedelic space above ground are engaging with.
And one more thing that I wanted to add is that all of these practitioners talked about their deep calling to the work, and I feel like that is really unique. And it wasn't necessarily something that was surprising to me, but the overwhelming loudness of their kind of communicating this message was really I don't know, it was notable. And you know, they felt the calling once they experienced mushrooms for the first time. They might have come to their, as Shannon was saying, everybody had kind of a story on how they came to the mushrooms, and that it caused some sort of healing within them that then spurred them to want to do this deeper work with other people and to guide other people through experiences as well. And that even though this work is illegal and that they, you know, could potentially go to jail because of it, that's not stopping them. Like, this is so important to them and who they are and to what they feel their kind of spiritual work is, that they keep doing it. And that was just really, really notable to me, and kind of one of the main big messages that I heard from, I think, every single interview that I read. So.
And I would just say that, like, yes, the healing, everybody had their personal calling into the work, but sometimes that personal introduction into the work was mushrooms kicked my butt. It was really hard for me. My first several experiences were really difficult, and for whatever reason, that calling was there, or the mushroom. But despite the fact that they kicked my butt, the mushroom showed me this, and then this, you know, synchronicities happened, or this happened, and so it was just a sense of like calling, that it wasn't necessarily just like a beautiful healing journey that everybody described, and then they just started facilitating for other people, and this beautiful healing journey. It's like, no, actually, I've been like through it with the mushroom.
I think personal relationships. I was, you know, when and if these medicines become legal, it seems like they're going to be in kind of a standardized assembly line sort of way, and they're even looking for like the fastest medicines that they can do. Like, they want to do 5-MeO because it only lasts 10 minutes, and you could crank people through. And what they said over and over again was the personal relationship was super important. Even for the microdosing coach that I interviewed. Like, you would think microdosing gets so little, it barely affects you, it just gives you the pills and then you move on. But he said it's really important to know who I'm getting them to, why they want to use it. I follow up in like a month, see how it's going, see if we need to adjust the dose. I mean, it really is like an old-fashioned, like, doctor-ish relationship where it's take 2, call me in a month. kind of thing. And so that personal relationship, I don't know how you can bring that into the above ground world or standardize that. It's difficult. The bandwidth is difficult, but everybody that I talked to said it was really important.
I mean, it's an expectation, and it's not, I mean, it's far-fetched to think about in our behavioral health system today, but if you think about in the 1950s and the early psychopharmacological revolution of what it's called, when all of the psychoactive pharmaceutical substances that we know today were starting to be developed. So you had like Thorazine in the mid-1950s, and psychiatrists at that time would, you know, inject themselves with Thorazine, or they would take the new psychoactive drug that the drug company came out with. They would take it, and not all of them, but there are certainly personal accounts of doctors, prescribers, psychiatrists taking Thorazine, writing their account of what it felt like, that subjective experience of it, and then coming to some clinical implications of like, oh, this could be useful for XYZ because it does this is what it feels like. I feel like a zombie, or everything's just really shut down and dulled. Oh, for people who are, you know, acutely psychotic, that maybe that'll help them dull the psychosis. And so that's how, like, it's not, it's been decades since we've had that sort of expectation of like that personal experimentation, but I don't think it's, you know, outside the bounds of what we know of as in sort of psychoactive medicine practice, even in our Western world.
I know a big kind of desire for the study was to inform policy. Like the fear was that the underground movement doesn't have a voice, and kind of all these shakers and movers creating law, creating legislation. Like, what do you see as their priority so far? What are they speaking to as far as their policy concerns and desires go?
The first thing that shocked me was how people didn't have a clear idea of what they wanted. I thought each person that I asked would say, I want this law, but not this law. I want to be regulated by the city, but not the state. I want, you know, and they didn't. And I guess that surprised me. And the other thing that surprised me was how they would go back and forth. I would say, well, would you like it to be regulated by the city? Yeah, some regulation would be good. Well, should they give licenses? Well, no licenses. Well, then how do they do it? If they don't give licenses, what do they do? Well, I don't know. So it seemed like ideas were being formed in people's heads almost as they were talking to me. And so that just, that surprised me, is the fluid nature of this discussion, even among the people that do the work all the time. That was interesting.
Yeah, the sense that I got, I mean, and the theme I think across the board was not wanting over-regulation. So having like some things in place around, you know, safety or age limits, you know, having some sort of guidelines in place, which feels really different than regulation, and even the ideas around, you know, how do we train people? Again, using like guidelines rather than requirements, and really allowing the community to inform some of this. Holding community as the accountability structure rather than government regulation as the accountability structure.
I think we also heard that nobody really wants it to go the way of pharmaceutical gatekeeping, you know, access issues for anybody. Like that was pretty overwhelming, and I think that's probably something that everybody in this room might agree to also. Like, we don't want it necessarily to be in the hands of some medical model.
And it was interesting because, like, I was expecting to hear the problems of Prohibition, and we certainly heard about the problems of Prohibition, and oh, you know, this is all in secret. You know, what if you know, how can you? Our clients aren't necessarily supported. They can't go back to sometimes their friends or communities or whatever networks and be able to like talk about this experience openly. I can't talk about this experience openly, so there's that bit of secrecy. There's concerns about like ethics, and because there's no accountability, everybody's just sort of working in their silos, and so everybody's heard of practitioners who have too loose of boundaries, or they're doing things that are just like, you should not be doing that. Like, it's not always just like, more mushrooms and more of this and more, like just doing too many substances too quickly without proper integration or things like that that people have differences of opinion about. And so there's like things that is just related to like prohibition that we were expecting. And then the other side of that though was the sort of the advantages of prohibition or the advantages of working in an unregulated underground kind of illegal space. And that was kind of surprising to me, that sort of clustering of things was coming out. So one, advantage is, well, it's non-standardized and it's not regulated. That means we have a lot of freedom and flexibility in how we do this practice. And I think that is in knowing how physically safe mushroom psilocybin is, that there weren't really concerns about like, giving too much or, people might be harmed or something by the mushrooms. It's like, no, having that sort of flexibility to have a non-standardized practice is actually just lots of room for many paths to healing or many paths into the work based off of where people are at, and finding the right sort of matchup and practitioner. And also, in this underground, unregulated space, practitioners know where their medicine comes from. Maybe they grew it, or they know the intention that was put into it. They might sing to it if they grew themselves. Like, there's all kinds of practices that people put, like, all of this intention. They test it on themselves, so they know what it is. And that's not something when it's regulated and controlled and you're doing it, you're not going to get that. Somebody had said it was sort of like, it'll become a cash cow, and some of that intentionality is lost, or you don't necessarily know where the medicine comes from. And if you believe, and as many people that we interviewed did, that there is some metaphysical aspect to working, particularly with this medicine, but you might say many psychedelic medicines, that requires some intuition, some trust, relationship within yourself and with the medicine, and that's not really a container that our Western medical clinical model can hold very well. And so there's concern about that being just really diluted and co-opted, and then what are we left with? Just the chemical, but without all of these other aspects of the practice.
Is there anything else that stood out to you so far that you've been surprised by, or even struck you in terms of your own participation in the study?
I mean, it was just fascinating reading all of the, we got to read everybody else's transcripts, and it's really, really interesting. Really, really interesting.
I think also just recognizing that, in a way, for folks who are involved in this work, like, this is, I don't want to say like mundane, it's not the right word, but this is their lives. Like, it's normal. It's something, it's not super sexy necessarily. So yeah, I mean, just recognizing the normalcy of this for the folks that we were interviewing.
Yeah, I felt deeply impacted by this project, and deeply honored by everyone whom I had the privilege to interview and to read their transcript. And yeah, I would say that this project made a big impact on a professional decision that I've come to recently, which is to not renew my therapist designation with the state and to take a stand for community practitioners.
Would you say more about that, why you're doing that, what it means?
You touched on it a little bit, Riley, when you talked about the depth of relationship and the way that that occurs. And most people are doing this work in a very different way than a clinical model and what the ethics allow for therapists and the ways to conduct themselves. So boundaries are different, relationships are different, people are entering into one another's homes. Yeah, and so there's just a way that this work is held that is so different than a therapeutic model, and I couldn't resolve that within myself. And this to me feels like, as someone who's been a trauma therapist, we heal trauma from the bottom up. and this to me feels like healing the trauma of the community and the collective from the bottom up, and that's what I want to support.
So your therapist designation puts you in a certain relationship with the person that you're working with, sets boundaries that you don't like, sets expectations that you don't like, and you want it to be more fluid. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's definitely some strong definitions around all of the legal regulations that are written, the ethical codes that are written. I mean, it's still not even really well accepted in a psychotherapy practice to touch your client, for example. And I'm someone who has multiple licenses. I'm also a massage therapist, and so there's just a way that our systems are so fragmented, we can't hold multidisciplinary approaches very well. And the therapeutic model is one of those models, and it takes the word, psyche, and privileges the mind, when really what we're looking at is the soul, and that's not included in the models. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. Yeah.
And I mean, related to this, that with the advantages of prohibition and unregulation is this deep sense of calling. So several people have mentioned the cash cow. This is going to become a cash cow. And once it's legal, you're going to have trainings and certifications and all the things. And right now, it's not easy to get into this work. I mean, it's a lot of this prolonged personal engagement and the risk taking and putting yourself out there and doing all your healing work. And so there's a lot of integrity and trust and calling that all the practitioners we talked to shared with us that got them into this work. Well, once legal and there's trainings on every corner or certification, and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a fun job to have. Oh yeah, I'll just do that. I'll be a guide now. I'll be a mushroom guide now. Or I did the holotropic breathwork workshop, or I had a mushroom experience that one time. I think I'm ready now. This seems like a cool job. Why not? And so there was that that sort of protective layer of keeping it illegal, actually, or that kind of really reinforces that sense of calling into it if you're going to work in that space. And somebody had sort of compared it to yoga teacher trainings that once, right? Yoga became very popularized in our Western context, and at some point, I don't know, I haven't really followed it, but at some point, yoga teacher trainings just started popping up everywhere. And maybe early on, it was for serious students of yoga who really held this philosophy very deeply, and they went into a teacher training, and this was a lifestyle, a way of being. To now, a yoga teacher training is anybody who can do some stretches and is willing to pay for a 200-hour course can be a yoga teacher now. It's sort of it got untethered from that deep philosophy and way of being attached to it. And so I think that was a really clear example in my mind that I heard from one of our interviewees of oh, this is where we're going. It could be kind of the same thing unless we get ahead of it as communities and figure out different approaches or more community-held models for how we're going to do this better.
Great. With that, I think we're going to open it up to y'all's questions. There's a lot of you in the audience. Yeah, if you want to raise a hand. I saw this guy in the front first.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys kind of have mentioned it a little bit, but I don't know necessarily if you've addressed it directly. Are most of the practitioners that you guys talk to for legalization of all of these drugs, or do you think they like having it being unregulated?
Good question.
Yeah, so the question, just in case anybody couldn't hear, was are most of these practitioners that we're interviewing for the legalization of psilocybin or against it?
I mean, they go back and forth. I mean, so this guy with Mishtek training, I said, should there be regulations? No regulations whatsoever. This is between me and nature, me and my God, whatever. So should just anybody? So I asked, so should just anybody be allowed to get it? No, not just anybody. Because I went to a rainbow gathering, those people are way too loose with it.
Well, it's also like you could pushing people on this question of like, okay, do you need a therapy background? So we were pushing people. I think everybody across the board agreed there should be some baseline training or certification or something around ethics, some accountability mechanisms. And then other than that, I think a number of people was like, well, but it could be helpful to have some background in trauma, trauma work, trauma therapy, trauma-informed care, something, because trauma comes up. So it'll be nice to like know, okay, so do you need to be like, do you need to have like a master's degree in therapy? I think there's some differences of opinion there. Like, do you have to have a therapy background? And some people were like, yeah, you definitely shouldn't, because I'm a therapist and it's been really useful to have that background. So they sort of assume that is what would be standardly useful. And then other people were just like, no, that 2 years in your master's degree is such an artificial certification that doesn't really, what's your relationship with the land, and what's your relationship with this medicine, and like how long have you been working with it, and how many, like that's the certification that matters to me. And so there was definitely some differences of opinion based off of maybe their own coming into the work, whether they have a therapy background or don't have a therapy background.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that legalization can look so many different ways. And it's a really difficult question to answer just in a very black and white way, because the context of it really matters. There seemed to be a majority of people, if I recall correctly, that were favorable towards decriminalization as a first step.
Like grow goods, gather, share kind of models.
Yeah, opening that up, and then from there, determining like, there's the policy review that's going on in Denver now, and I'm sure they're finding out things. So just like opening things up one step at a time, rather than putting too much structure in place that's unnecessary.
Yeah. I think. Oh. Is this working? Yes. I think another thing that we saw are just ideas around things that need to change in the culture, along with whatever regulatory frameworks would be changing. So, for example, looking at healing in a really holistic way. Like if you're dealing with addiction, it's not just about the drug. There's like a root cause that's causing addiction, whether it's trauma, late stage neoliberal capitalism, and and so just understanding culturally that this isn't just about, as Shannon was alluding to, just like symptom reduction. This is something much bigger. It's about shifting someone's relationship with themselves, with the natural world, with their communities, and folks asking and wanting for that paradigm shift to be happening alongside with whatever tangible, like regulatory stuff is happening as well.
I think it's safe to say that none of the people I interviewed want anyone to go to jail for having a medicine, giving a medicine in a safe way, right?
It seems like there's got to be sort of this new model that we haven't quite nailed down yet, and that it might involve, many different paths to becoming a practitioner in some sense, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, no, I think that was some of the struggle that we were hearing from from our interviewees that Riley was alluding to, with that. Well, no, I don't want to be regulated, but it should be a little bit. Not that person should be able to do it, but we want this, but not that, and because we're trying to fit something that doesn't exist in our context into our existing structures and regulations and how we do things and how we provide education and like the pieces of paper that we put on our walls. And it's like, well, how do we take that and fit it here? And I think that was sort of the disconnect that people were trying to come to terms with. And so it really, I feel like out of all of this, it's creating new containers, like the Western medical clinical. Not that people shouldn't be able to go to a clinic or a doctor and do psilocybin. Like that should be one of the pathways, and it shouldn't be the only pathway, is what I'm hearing, and it's personally what I also feel. But that Western medical clinical model is never going to be able to hold this, because Western science has never been able to really grapple with spirituality, with trust, with intuition. It's all about evidence-based medicine and protocols and risk assessment and here, fill out this checklist and then we'll know what to do. And this is just like the antithesis of everything that is. And so trying to like fit it within that just doesn't make any sense. So some kind of new profession, new containers, new paradigms, new everything, I think to be able to hold this with all of the paradigm shifting, profound healing potential that exists, we've got to be a little bit more creative as a community about how we do this.
It's a weird paradox trying to systematize something that by its nature is a disruptor.
There we go.
I have 2 questions.
Do you have any answers?
No, I really want to know this stuff from you guys. So we're talking about psilocybin. Psilocybin comes from mushrooms. What mushrooms? And so in the world of psilocybin, you've got psilocybin cubensis. These are the basic mushrooms that I grew up with when I was a kid. The classics, right? So your golden teachers, Purple Magic, Mountain Majesty, B+. When you get into the psychedelic culture or the horticulture space of mushrooms, you get into the vastness. You learn that there's hundreds and hundreds of variety types of mushrooms. And so all of a sudden there's these new kids on the block, like albino penis envy. A lot of mushroom people don't even know that there are potent psilocybe funguses that do not grow in the shape of mushrooms, such as enigma. And then in mushroom horticulture, there's the flush. So when you grow your mushrooms, you have your almost vegetative state from a plant perspective, which is your mycelium. And this mycelium blooms anywhere between 4, 6, maybe 8 times. And in psilocybe culture, there's a lot of people that argue with each other that the first bloom is the most potent. And that after that bloom has bloomed, it has absorbed the nutrients that it has, and it becomes less and less potent each flush afterwards. And so my question is, what do you guys do about access? What are you accessing? Do you know that what you're using in your therapy for this patient, when you're thinking this is a dose? Because a dose, 1 gram of typical psilocybe cubensis is not the same thing as 1 gram as another type of mushroom, such as albino penis envy, which is 5 to 10 times more potent. What do you guys think?
Well, here's a short answer. Do y'all know Max? We're not going to have him for much longer here.
So just quickly for people who might have not heard, the question is about access, potency, growing mushrooms. What are these practitioners doing in relationship to all these questions?
I'm going to give a quick answer and see if anybody else wants to touch on this. My quick answer is that our CSU IRB did not want didn't want us asking practitioners directly where they source their mushrooms, how they get them, that was just because this was new territory for our university. They were like, I don't know, we need to get our lawyers to look at it. And we're like, okay, we'll just not ask directly how they get whatever. So we'll just leave that out and keep it more focused on like policy and their practices and stuff. So one, we didn't ask directly because of our IRB. Anybody else have a sense of?
Yeah, well, people are testing out what they use, and they seem to have a relationship with the cultivator that they're with. And I also get curious about like opening up the conversation beyond dose, because there are many, many contributing factors to someone's experience, and they could have from the exact same batch, the exact same, and have 2 completely different experiences. And so I think that we need to broaden the conversation beyond that. Where some things could be helpful, and that I know that are under development, are testing kits. And so just like DanceSafe provides testing kits for non-natural substances. You know, hopefully we will arrive at a point where people can start to test mushrooms and see and look at things like potency as well, so that there's another layer of awareness.
And I think we did hear from many of the practitioners that they actually try the mushrooms themselves, so that they test it and they understand what that potency feels like.
And people are pretty conservative overall. Like, usually people are starting individuals off with a smaller dose if they don't know how they'll respond. And so there's actually quite a bit of thoughtfulness to that layer of how people are working.
And in addition to that, sometimes starting people off with just meditation techniques, or maybe even ketamine or MDMA, a medicine which might be a little less disruptive than mushrooms. So we also saw that, like, these practitioners, some of them are only working with mushrooms, some of them are working with a variety of different medicines, some of them are working with different strains of mushrooms as well, and have different strains for different purposes.
So sorry we weren't able to answer your question as specifically and scientifically.
No, you guys did great, and I
it.
really appreciate all of you for what you're doing. Thank you guys for being on stage,
Thanks, Max.
having this conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so as I'm building my practice, I'm kind of trying to get my doomer perspective down, find out what all the big red buttons are. Like, if you're not a therapist, you can't use the word psychology or psyche on your website or as you're selling your practice. But that's more of in the like regulation realm, whereas working with medicines is a completely different thing. And there's a lot of regulation around that, obviously, as well. So I'm just wondering, like, do you guys know anyone who's gotten screwed for not working in their sphere of competence from the neoliberal capitalist overlords?
Yeah. Do you know anybody who's had negative repercussions from working with medicine?
And how they handled it?
Yeah.
Well, I think if you're a therapist, are you a therapist?
I'm not.
Okay, but I don't know if that's, or not, you're not a therapist, but that's the thing. You're not a therapist, you're not a psychologist, but you're wanting to, you don't have to get too much detail.
I can't tell you what I do because they're watching over me.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I think people navigate this differently. One thing I will say that many practitioners conveyed was that they don't really promote themselves, they don't market. People come to them. People find them, it's word of mouth, so they don't sort of put themselves out there necessarily. Some do, some do, but I think most of them are like, I've never needed to market myself. It comes and it happens, and I trust it. And I think in a sort of separate question, if you are promoting, and this is not legal advice, but I think the sort of standard practice is that you can provide harm reduction education and harm reduction psychotherapy if you're a therapist, and psychedelic integration work, but you do not provide illegal substances, you do not encourage people to use them. I mean, I think there's some sort of standard languaging that is attorney approved. Don't use what I just said, but it's like around, that kind of sphere of things.
I'm not aware of a lot of people getting in a lot of trouble, generally speaking.
I mean, generally speaking, I'll just say my personal bias is if we practice embodied ethics, and we know embodied ethics through our own experience and through our own scope of deep training and deep work, then we're not at much risk of getting into trouble for something, because we know deeply how to hold the space.
And it actually wasn't a concern, even in the problems of Prohibition, being arrested or having the feds bang down your door. That didn't really come up as when we were asking them, what are the risks, what are the concerns, what concerns you most about this environment. It wasn't fear of arrest. Not that fear shouldn't be. I don't know if that's a valid fear or justified or not. I don't know, and so I wouldn't want to make you feel a false sense of ease around that. But that wasn't a top concern that came up, I think, for any of our interviewees.
Do you guys even have a sense of like how they regulate that stuff? Like, do they have some people searching through Google looking for life coaches who use the word psyche on their website?
If you work for the NSA, please stand up. We have time for about one more question. Yeah.
So the way this works, I'm actually a lawyer that practices in this space.
Tell us.
Yeah, the way it works is usually people inform on someone else. So the way this can come up is if you're an unlicensed practitioner, you're practicing psychotherapy, and you've held yourself out as practicing psychotherapy. I actually have a client right now that was engaged in practicing psychotherapy and told his client he was practicing psychotherapy.
It was not a therapist.
Now he's
might want to
facing
get him a
grievance
microphone.
with the Department of Justice authorities.
Hi there. My name is Brad. I'm a lawyer in this space. What I was saying is that where people get in trouble is if you're practicing with someone and you're making a representation that you're a therapist and you're actually not. So if you're a licensed professional counselor and you're practicing in the space, you're okay, right? Not okay because there is still prohibition, okay? And I would encourage everyone to take that very seriously. There are serious legal, criminal repercussions for practicing in this space, whether you're a licensed psychotherapist, psychiatrist, licensed professional counselor, you can go to jail, okay? And the way this really comes up in my experience has been that if something goes wrong in the context of your practice, right, which is occasion to happen, right? Someone has a bad experience and they decide to go to the authorities and take their complaint to the authorities, then they start investigating you or your practice or your company, right? And then you start getting in some hot water, okay? If you're an unlicensed psychotherapist or practicing some form of therapy and you tell someone you're practicing therapy, right? That is actually a criminal offense in the state of Colorado. The district attorney can prosecute you, and there are criminal repercussions for that. Okay? So you have to be very careful what you're telling your clients in that particular context. But even working with psychedelics, especially psilocybin in particular, it's a Schedule I controlled substance both under federal and state law. So there are both civil and criminal repercussions for working with it. And there's these concepts that are left over from the drug war of the 80s, like aiding and abetting. So if you decide to go sit with someone who is, say, under the influence of psilocybin, even though you didn't provide them, that can arguably be aiding and abetting. It can be a conspiracy. So you have to be very mindful of what you're doing. And there's two different concepts you need to understand when you're getting into this practice. There's criminal repercussions and there's civil repercussions. You can ameliorate through contract civil repercussions. So if something goes wrong in a civil context, like you can have a contract with that patient to ameliorate those repercussions. Criminal repercussions, you cannot, right? So someone can still come after you for that particular practice. So whatever you do in this space, if you're practicing, this is a really important practice. And what I think you folks have said here today is that what you're working on are what I consider to be norms, right, for this practice. It's not laws, it's norms. This is becoming a normative practice. What you're establishing for the community is, hey, this is how we want to practice this if and when it becomes above ground, right, when it becomes legal. And this is really important work because you're setting the stage for what comes next. And I think yoga is a great example, right? Because now that's come out of the woodwork, you have certification, and I think that was an important part of the process, right? This is different only because it is a controlled substance. It is considered criminal. It's considered criminal behavior, so you have to be very mindful how you do all this. So excellent work. This was an excellent panel.
Thank you, Brad. Welcome.
Thank you, guest panelists, for
We're going to close out here. That this is we're still interviewing, we're still reading transcripts and going through our data analysis process. So there's going to be more here. This was our initial impressions, some of the preliminary things that we're hearing in these interviews, but this is not the final set of findings. And there was more questions we asked practitioners that we didn't even get to touch on tonight. So do expect more to come from this. We will be publishing it. We'll be presenting it in other venues. But we just wanted to do a, kind of a sneak peek share with our community of what's happening right now and the conversations that we're having. So thank you.
With that, if you clap. Just a few closing notes. Remember, community is a medicine in and of itself. Feel free to mingle, talk to people. With that, remember, to Brad's point, these are all illegal substances. We don't want to promote an atmosphere where there's this acquisition, so please, out of respect for us and the Nowak Society and Mercury Cafe, don't try and ask people for illegal drugs at this venue. With that, get to know each other, have a good time. Feel free to talk to our panelists afterwards, and thank you for coming out.